Hello and welcome to PCB Chat, where we talk with experts across the printed circuit design, manufacturing, and electronic supply chain fields. I'm Mike Buetow, president of PCEA. The Printed Circuit Board Association of America, or PCBAA, was founded in 2021 to advance U.S. domestic production of PCBs and base materials. My guest today is Travis Kelly, president and chief executive of Isola, the materials developer, and chairman of the PCBAA. Travis, Happy New Year, and welcome back to PCB Chat.
Thank you, Mike, and Happy New Year to you as well. Always a pleasure to be back.
You've launched a weekly newsletter with updates on the industry happenings. One recent piece that was linked to was titled, "What Do Small Companies Need to Know About the CHIPS Act?" Since most of the U.S. PCB market could be characterized as small companies, what do you think those firms need to know about H.R. 7677, the Supporting American Printed Circuit Boards Act?
Yeah, so I think that's an exciting piece of legislation that was introduced on the floor last year. It's a bipartisan bill. So it has Blake Moore, the Republican from Utah, that supports it, as well as Anna Eshoo, the Democrat from California. So it's great that it's a bipartisan bill. It's also very impactful that it's probably the first time the term printed circuit board was ever mentioned in Congress. And it shows the momentum that the entire ecosystem is gaining outside of semiconductors. You know, obviously the focus for the last several years has been on semiconductors. The fact that now the printed circuit board domestic industry has a bill they can point to is very important. So ultimately, what we want people to know, both medium-sized, small-sized, and large-sized companies, is that this bill will be put forward again in this year. We need to garner further support and have other sponsors of the bill. And then ultimately, we will need a Senate companion bill to push it through. It's extremely important. It helps build up the domestic industry and create that secure and resilient supply chain that we've discussed before, Mike. So ultimately, what we want people to know as well is there's really two components. One is generating a pull strategy. So in this bill, there is a tax credit, 25% to the OEM. So not to the actual fabricator or assembler or the material suppliers. It's actually to the OEM. So for every American-made printed circuit board that the OEM acquires, they receive a 25% tax credit, which is significant. The second piece of the legislation that's important is a $3 billion investment into the industry itself. And that would be bifurcated by research and development, brick and mortar, learning, so STEM, on-the-job training. So you really have two significant aspects of that bill that we want everyone to know about within the domestic industry so they can support it and they can have their representatives of Congress support it as well.
Semiconductors are pretty easy to understand. I mean, everyone probably still remembers the Intel Inside campaigns. You just mentioned the semi-companion bill. What are you suggesting that the PCB bill would have to be tied to a larger piece of legislation in order to pull it through?
Yeah, so when we look for a Senate companion bill, we need to make sure that obviously to get something passed, we need not only the House of Representatives, Congress to pass it, but also a Senate companion bill that supports it as well, and then it can get approved by the administration. So that's really what we're looking for, is making sure that we have both chambers of the Capitol approving the bill, which I think ultimately it's extremely important that it does get passed. And I think it makes a lot of sense. You're going to hear, arguments around the industry. Do we need to have a resilient and secure supply chain for everything? And you could make an argument that you should. We're not myopic, we being the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. We're not myopic in our view. We understand it's a global economy. It's always going to be a global economy. But for those end segments that we've discussed before, Mike, like your critical infrastructure, like 5G, obviously aerospace and defense, medical, as well as banking, you do, as a nation, want to have that secure and resilient supply chain. So I think that's why you'll see both support at the House and at the Senate level for legislation like this.
And Travis, I have to apologize. I'm fighting a cold and I only hear like about half of what I should. So you said Senate companion bill and I misheard you and I thought you said semiconductor,
Oh,
like semi
no worries.
companion
No,
bill. So,
Senate.
okay. So that may explain sort of the weird syntax to my question.
Mhm.
So does Congress get the critical infrastructure aspect to all this? I mean, do they understand it?
I think they're beginning to. Our message at the PCBAA and some of our sister and I'll say partners like USPAE and IPC, we've done a lot of work educating and advocating, and we are seeing it resonate because all the different organizations are getting called into Washington almost on a frequent basis to continue that messaging. So when you take semiconductors, for example, we support the CHIPS Act, but as you know, building the wafers in the United States doesn't necessarily solve the root cause because the IC substrates or the high density interconnects, advanced packaging, that still happens overseas. So as we start discussing this with members, it's resonating that in order to really create that secure and resilient supply chain, it's an ecosystem. It's not just the wafers and it's not just packaging. It's the printed circuit boards too that the chips have to be packaged onto the boards. And it's really addressing that holistic view of what it takes to ensure that you have that resilient supply chain, as opposed to just fixing pieces on the fringes. It has to be a holistic approach. And that is gaining momentum.
Now, you identified that with the new Congress seated, HR 7677 would have to be reintroduced. Have you received any insight from any of the original sponsors indicating that they plan to do so?
We have, and obviously, I think it's going to be really at the top of the agenda. I think we'll hear more about it within the next month or two. Obviously, the codification will change as HR 7677. That number will change, but the bill will still exist. Obviously, and now, especially now that we have a speaker, I think legislative actions will move forward as opposed to being delayed.
Any insight as to whether any of the incoming congressmen and congresswomen are going to be supportive of this?
We've actually spent a fair amount of time on the Hill, we being the PCBAA, myself and the president, and now we have a new executive director, David Shield, who has joined the organization. He's actually been part of it for quite some time, so it's a very smooth transition. So we will be spending more time, actually starting next week, we're back up on the Hill again, pushing the legislation through. We have met with numerous representatives of Congress who have told us they're going to support the bill. We don't see that. We don't see we don't see us losing any momentum. So I think going back, over the next several months, we'll continue to gain those co-sponsors. And once again, if you look at the membership of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America, it's billions and billions of dollars of economics because of the membership base and the number of states that are represented by some of our largest companies in the organization. So there's a lot of momentum too. As we all know, numbers speak in Washington and the overall economic impact speaks in Washington. The PCBAA, I believe, has a really nice representation of the U.S. and the different, the significance that we play in the overall industry.
To my knowledge, the original legislation didn't really detail the roadmap. It kind of left that to the industry to establish. It provided the funding mechanism, but it was kind of skimpy on the details as to what actually was going to happen on the ground. What is PCBAA doing in this regard to kind of flesh that out?
Yeah, so ultimately, we're spending a lot of our time on is how do you transform? Originally, you need the investment, so you need a piece of legislation that can boost the industry. So that's really the $3 billion investment. And then you also need that pull strategy where you're receiving, the OEMs receiving some type of tax credit, which will level the playing field. We do know that competition overseas, primarily in Asia, is difficult for the U.S. to compete against because a lot of these different industries are subsidized. So one thing that's extremely important is that this will level the playing field, but at the same time, where a lot of companies are struggling from a PCB and PCBA standpoint, is it's hard to write that investment thesis without really understanding the demand signal. So if you were just to look at defense, that's roughly 3% of global market share. And it would be very difficult for most PCB domestic companies to write a capital check to invest arguably, let's say, $200 million into launching a brick and mortar facility that can not only scale up with increased demand, but also have the higher technology elements that would be needed to compete. So what we're really looking for is not only a bill that can help prop up the industry and create that pull strategy, but also looking for government influence as well as private industry in terms of identifying those key market segments that we want to have a resilient and secure supply chain for. Because if you were to agree, if all of us were to agree that that is aerospace and defense, medical, banking, infrastructure like 5G and so on, that's roughly 26% of the global market share. So now you're creating a sustainable domestic industry. So, Mike, I think that's an absolutely critical point. So as we, what are we doing to educate people? What are we doing to discuss the bill? The bill is extremely important as a catalyst, but also when you get into the discussion around a sustainable industry, that's what we're really focused on, is also ensuring that we can provide our members with some type of, I'll say, clarity around a demand signal to allow them to go to their boards of directors or their investment committees and write that capital expenditure for $100 or $200 million.
Let's talk about that $3 billion figure for a moment. How is that actually allocated? You mentioned the tax incentives. Is that built into that $3 billion, or is the $3 billion cash that would be coming from the U.S. government to be invested in U.S. manufacturing?
Yeah, it's bifurcated. So the $3 billion is a standalone. The 25% tax credit is something separate from that. So the bill really has those two separate components. The $3 billion is truly an investment. It hasn't been, I'll say, allocated relative to, it should be 20% going to R&D. It should be 30% going into new technologies. It's really an earmark saying, look, based on the industry and where it needs to go, based on the amount, there's only roughly 140 PCBA shops left in America. Here's an amount that makes sense to really kickstart the domestic industry. We know, with high density interconnects and everything else, the amount of density now that will be required not only on packaging but a printed circuit board, that technology exists in Asia, but we have to bring it here. And once again, it's very difficult to, I'll say, be the trailblazer and invest that type of capital if you don't really know that there will be demand there. So that's one thing that we really have to work through. And I think that's one reason the bill is so important too, by having that $3 billion earmarked for the industry, because ultimately we need to prove out technology, and what we know is needed today will not be what is needed 5 years from now. So it's that constant investment in capital that is required to make sure that you stay on the cutting edge and constantly innovate.
$3 billion would be equal to almost the entirety of the U.S. domestic PCB market. Is that funding earmarked for a single year, or would it be spread out over a number of years?
It would have to be spread out over a number of years, because if you can think too, one thing we're going to run into is, and I always say this, when you offshore your manufacturing know-how, you do offshore a lot of the technological know-how. So when you think, I always use the example, signal integrity engineers, but I think most of us in manufacturing know it's very difficult to find mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, chemical engineers. So when you think about the DNA and the skill sets that will be required and the skill sets that we also offshored overseas and bringing that back, it's a multi-year investment, because ultimately a lot of I shouldn't say a lot, but there obviously will be some allocation to STEM. There'll be some allocation of workforce development, because right now to find a lot of these positions, companies have to register for an H-1B visa and bring the signal integrity engineers in country, and that's difficult. So it's going to be a multi-year investment.
That makes sense to me. Having participated several times in the IPC Capitol Hill days, the prevailing message from Congress was always jobs, jobs, jobs. How many jobs in my district will this create? And so you've now addressed sort of how these investments in the PCB industry would take into account the manpower needs. I mean, I've talked with Matt Kelly of IPC about this, and I know there's a focus on more smart or lights out style factories, but of course we aren't even close to being ready for that. So, understanding what will happen in the meantime, I think is really a big piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, you just touched on 2 points that I'm gonna foot stomp. First and foremost, for the domestic U.S. industry to be competitive, you do have to look for smart factories and automation, right? But that is not a silver bullet. I attend a lot of meetings and for numerous companies. Automation is definitely needed. But when you automate factories or you go to the smart factory, you're increasing the skill level that you need to help run those facilities. So people always think that if it takes 100, 100 people to run a facility, if you automate it, you're down to 30. That may be the case, but those 30, that skill set you need in that 30 is much different than what you need with the 100. Because those 30 are going to be controls engineers, are going to be mechanical engineers, because now you have a lot of machines and robots. And my point being that, yes, we would have to figure out a way to be competitive across the global landscape. In order to do that, to compete with countries that have less costly labor, we would need to automate. However, the good thing is, and the one point I like to make, is as we automate factories, as we continue to become more efficient, the workforce of America will also increase in terms of skill set, because you're going to have controls engineers. You're going to have a very high level of skill to run these factories. And I think the country will benefit from that. Because you're going to have to invest not only in the schooling system, but on the job training and so on and so forth. So I actually think it's a very, very big benefit as you get that, very knowledgeable workforce put together. I think you'll see a lot of different industries benefit from that. Now that takes a lot of time, and we're speaking in philosophies, but ultimately, that this is a decade investment. But you can really see where we have to go as a country in order to be competitive in those end segments.
The first time I saw AGVs on the floor was actually at the Isola plant in Düren, Germany, back in 2001.
They're still there.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it's fascinating, right? How slowly the rollout has been worldwide, and just to the point, I interviewed folks from Lacroix, the French EMS company, in late December. And one of the things that France has identified, much as the way that many countries are, is they've identified electronics and manufacturing as being critical to the future of the country. And the amount of investment that the French government is pouring into individual companies, in order for them to prove out some of these technologies, Lacroix has been the beneficiary of several $1 million in direct government subsidies. You go through the plant now, and it's very automated with these 2-story high inventory towers and robots and AGVs all over the place. The question that comes up then is just how exactly would something like that, if indeed that's what's going to happen here, and I might be jumping ahead, but how exactly would that work? Would individual companies apply for grants? Would multiple companies work together to prove out a technology and then share in the benefit of that, with the government underwriting some of the cost? What's the projected model, or has that even been bandied about yet?
Well, it's definitely being discussed, and you actually hit on 2 points. I think what we're going to see is you're going to have individual companies that may request a grant from the government to develop certain technology, or address a problem that needs to be resolved. I think also a lot of work is being done right now, to your last point, relative to, okay, do you see several companies, and companies can be, PCB companies, it can be material science companies like Isola, it can even be OEMs working with the government to develop, a center of excellence to develop technology, I think you're spot on. And then should it be a proven technology? Should it work? Sharing that know-how with the individual companies. So a lot, I don't think anyone has their voice around specifically, let's go, let's do option A versus option B. But all those options are being discussed as we speak today. Because that's one thing that we have to figure out is what is the best path forward? Is it bifurcating $3 billion amongst numerous companies, or is it looking at, really defining the problem statement first and foremost? What are we trying to accomplish? Defining that problem statement, investing in fixing that problem statement or finding solutions, and then spreading that know-how to the other companies. So you're spot on, Mike, and I definitely don't have a specific answer on how it's going to. And normally I always say, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I'm sure it'll be a hybrid approach, but those options are being discussed.
Would you expect that U.S.-based manufacturers that are foreign-owned? We've had a couple companies in the U.S. just recently. A couple fabricators are in the process of being acquired by a North American, but not a U.S.-based company. Would you expect that companies like that would still be eligible for these types of grants?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I shouldn't opine because ultimately you never know how the rules and regulations will be written. I know I've been told that, is it an allied country, right? Is it an allied country? Is it obviously, U.S. owned? If it's not, then as long as it's an allied country, it should be okay. And then there'll be particulars too. If you're, not U.S. owned, but you're U.S. domiciled, do you sell into companies on the entity list, which you're not allowed to do? If you do, you're disqualified. So I think there's going to be, a lot of thought around, okay, what are the rules of engagement? And, what kind of citizen do you have to be in order to play in it? And I think those will be defined as we move forward. But there has been much discussion around that right now.
I know this is speculation, but do you think that the process that's being used for the semiconductor industry will probably play out for PCBs as well? When you look at Samsung, TSMC, and people like those companies that are benefiting from, the U.S. investment?
I would think so. I mean, just, looking at it from a business standpoint, once you have the foundries coming like Intel, like TSMC, they're going to require an ecosystem. Right. And you would, I hate to speculate, but I do believe you will see some of the ecosystem move to the United States. So material suppliers, printed circuit board fabricators and assemblers and the like. I don't think it has to be 100% US. I think what you're probably going to see is growth in North America in general. So I think you probably will see companies domiciling in Mexico as well as Canada. I think the jury's still out, but you would have to believe with the amount of investment coming from the semiconductor companies that you're going to see people piggyback on those movements.
In your conversations with Congress, does the investment in other countries ever come up? I mean, I'm looking at Vietnam, Thailand, countries that really didn't scratch the surface of the PCB market, 10 years ago, that are now seeing investment that is much greater than what we've seen in North America. And the size of those markets is pretty impressive as well, relative, again, to U.S., not necessarily compared to Taiwan or China, but relative to other regions.
It does come up because obviously, once again, when the day ends, the CEOs and the boards that are overseeing these companies need to make the right economic decisions. And right now, you're right. Because of a lot of geopolitical issues, you're seeing Southeast Asia open up. Not that it was ever closed, but you're seeing it open up a lot more. And you're seeing definitely a lot. I shouldn't say a lot, because that's a generalization, but you are seeing companies that are either domiciled in China or Taiwan now looking at building brick and mortar in Malaysia or in Thailand or in Vietnam. And a lot of that too is these companies receive good incentives to do so. Obviously, I think that's one reason that HR 7677 is so important, because in order for the U.S. to compete, the government will have to look at investments to attract some of that industry.
Travis, based on the logos on the PCBAA website, you're now up to 18 corporate members. As your membership grows, how do you think it will affect the association's ability to maintain consensus and focus?
Yeah, that's always the discussion, because we want to make sure we have, like I said, we have other organizations that we do a lot of work with, like USPAE and IPC. But each organization is different, because we are laser focused on the printed circuit board assemblers, printed circuit board fabricators, material science companies. And that vision we don't want to waver from. We want to make sure that when we're on the Hill, that we are truly focused on this subset of the overall ecosystem, and a very important subset, but we have to keep our voice around what we're trying to accomplish. So a lot of the times, and we meet with new members, prospective members, we are very candid in our vision and what we're trying to accomplish. And if that doesn't align with potential members, then that's okay. But we definitely want to make sure our message is very clear. And I think that's one reason we've had so many successes, be it with the National Defense Authorization Act, having the new legislation introduced on the floor, 7677. For a relatively new organization like the PCBAA, we've shown that we can get consequential things done in a very quick, very short amount of time.
One of the things that you have gotten done, right, is, as you mentioned a little while ago, you've named your first executive director. Tell our listeners a little bit about David Shield and why he's the right person for the job.
Yeah, so that's a great question. When we first formulated and came up with the PCBAA, there was 5 founding members. And in order to really grow the membership base, we wanted to have a really strong presence as it relates to social media. We wanted to professionalize the organization, because we had to stand it up really from nothing, from scratch. And luckily, we met David at the very beginning. He was... came from a defense prime, understands Washington inside and out, and really helped us build a nice PR team that could give us the social presence and in social media, develop the website, and really help us get our voice around the mission and vision and strategic objectives for the organization. So he was really at the ground level with us. So as the organization grew, and he played a big role in that, he would also attend numerous meetings on the Hill. So it's a very easy transition. He's well respected in Washington, and it makes a lot of sense because he understands how to get things done. And as you probably know, Mike, Washington is very complex. And we have very strong lobbying. With David's, I'll say, vision, as well as, the president, Will Marsh. I do, Will and I are both volunteers for these roles. As you know, I have a day job, and so does Will Marsh. So David can literally focus on the PCBAA and take us to that next evolution. Right. I like to say that, over the last 2 years, we've got a lot of consequential things done. We were on, version 1. Now David's moving us to version 2, and then version 3, and so on and so forth. So we're very excited to have him.
When's your next annual meeting?
Yeah, so we normally piggyback with the USPAE, because we have relatively the same members. There's obviously several different ones. So normally we do it in March or April, and we'll do the USPAE meeting for a day or two, and then we'll have the a night and the full day the following day for the PCBAA.
And Travis, why don't you mention the PCBAA website and how people would find out more information if they want to become a corporate member or get involved?
Yeah, that's great. So if you go to pcbaa.org, you will see our website, and you can inquire about membership. We are structuring in such a way you can be, obviously you can have a corporate membership, and there's different tiers depending on how engaged you want to be. Engagement means if you want to be a gold member, you actually have an opportunity to sit on the board of the PCBAA. rotates every 2 years. There's silver memberships, bronze memberships, and then we have individuals. There's consultants that have been with the industry for 30 plus years that are now members. So we have personal membership as well, where people can stay involved, stay connected. We send out a weekly newsletter. Obviously, we do monthly calls with our lobbying teams and our PR teams. So if you really want to stay abreast of what's happening in Washington as it relates to microelectronics, as it relates to what we're accomplishing, it's great because we have different tiers that can suit almost anyone's needs.
Is there anything else that you think we should share with our listeners before we wrap?
Well, I just think 2023 is going to be extremely important. I think the momentum is going to still be there. Obviously there's a lot happening in the world. You're seeing, China relax their COVID-19 policies, so that will open up China quite a fair bit. But they're still having a large COVID-19 outbreak, which is hurting companies over there. Obviously the energy crisis in Europe is going to be with us for some time, specifically certain countries like Germany. So I think there's still going to be geopolitical and macroeconomic issues. What does all that mean? That means the resiliency of the supply chain, I don't believe will improve greatly in 2023. We'll see bits and pieces. I don't think you're going to have ships slow steaming because you're going to see a demand drop if we go into a global recession. So you're going to hit that inflection point where although things aren't going smoothly, let's say around the world, you're also going to have less demand because things are more expensive. But ultimately, I think 2023 is going to be a challenging year. And I think this is really where, the PCBAA can make a name for itself on really working to resolve some of these supply chain issues, because we're going to be stuck with them for some time.
Our guest today has been Travis Kelly, President and Chief Executive of Isola and the Chairman of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. For PCB Chat, this is Mike Buetow. Have a nice day.